Silence hides dangerous people better than anger ever could. The truth is, the most destructive individuals rarely walk into a room looking cruel. Most of them look calm, intelligent, polite. Some even appear deeply caring in the beginning. That is what makes them dangerous. Real evil does not always arrive with violence or obvious hatred. Sometimes it arrives with a smile, soft words, attention, support, and fake understanding. Sometimes the people who damage your mental peace the most are the same people others describe as charming, confident, or emotionally strong. And that is why so many people ignore the warning signs until the damage is already done. By the time they finally understand who they were dealing with, they are left emotionally exhausted, confused, anxious, and questioning their own judgment. The scary part is that people with dark intentions rarely reveal themselves early. They study people first, they learn weaknesses, they learn emotional patterns. Then slowly, over time, their real personality begins to appear through repeated behaviors that most people overlook. Small signs, cold reactions, manipulation hidden behind kindness, control disguised as care, cruelty hidden behind jokes. And once you finally recognize those patterns, it changes the way you see people forever. Psychology experts have spent years studying toxic personalities, emotional manipulation, narcissistic behavior, and dark personality traits. One lesser-known fact is that many emotionally harmful people are not emotionally unstable at all. In fact, some are extremely controlled. They understand emotions very well, but they use that understanding to influence, pressure, and quietly dominate others. Studies connected to dark personality behavior have shown that some individuals feel little emotional guilt after hurting people if their actions give them power, attention, or control. That is why certain people can lie calmly, manipulate confidently, and destroy trust without showing visible regret. For them, emotional damage is not a tragedy, it is strategy. And that reality becomes terrifying once you notice how common these behaviors actually are. Some of the most emotionally dangerous people are not criminals. They are ordinary individuals hiding behind normal lives, relationships, friendships, workplaces, and families. They blend into everyday life so well that many victims spend years blaming themselves before realizing the truth. One of the darkest parts of emotional manipulation is that it often happens slowly, not in one dramatic moment, not through one obvious betrayal, but through repeated small behaviors that weaken confidence over time. A sarcastic insult disguised as humor, a guilt trip disguised as love, a controlling action disguised as protection, a lie disguised as concern. Little by little, the victim begins losing emotional clarity, and the manipulator gains more influence. This is why many people trapped around toxic personalities struggle to explain what feels wrong. Nothing seems extreme at first, but emotionally they feel drained, anxious, guilty, and mentally tired around the same person again and again. One psychological study discovered that emotionally manipulative individuals often create confusion intentionally because confused people become easier to control. When a person constantly questions their own thoughts, memories, reactions, and emotions, they slowly become dependent on the manipulator's version of reality. This behavior is more common than most people realize, and many victims never notice it until years later. Another disturbing fact is that some people genuinely enjoy emotional power over others. They enjoy making people insecure. They enjoy emotional dependence. They enjoy feeling needed, feared, or emotionally dominant. And the worst part is that these individuals often hide behind confidence and charisma. Society sometimes mistakes emotional coldness for strength. It mistakes manipulation for intelligence. It mistakes selfishness for leadership. And because of that, many dangerous personalities receive trust they never deserved in the first place. There are people who know exactly how to appear trustworthy, while secretly damaging the emotional stability of everyone close to them. Some destroy relationships. Some destroy confidence. Some destroy peace, and many do it so quietly that nobody notices until the victim becomes emotionally broken. One of the most painful realizations in life is understanding that not everyone who smiles at you wants the best for you. Some people only value access to your emotions, your attention, your kindness, your loyalty, or your energy. Once they stop benefiting from you, their mask slowly disappears. That shift can feel shocking because the person you trusted suddenly becomes cold, distant, manipulative, or even cruel without explanation. But the truth is, the signs were often there from the beginning. Most people simply did not recognize them early enough. Human behavior experts often explain that repeated patterns reveal character more honestly than words ever can. Anybody can pretend temporarily. Anybody can act kind for a short period of time. But long-term behavior always exposes the truth. Consistent disrespect exposes hidden arrogance. Constant manipulation exposes hidden control. Fake apologies expose lack of guilt, and emotional cruelty exposes a deeper darkness inside the personality itself. That is why understanding these traits matters so much. This video is not about creating fear or paranoia. It is about awareness. It is about learning the psychological patterns connected to emotionally dangerous people before those patterns damage your peace, confidence, or mental health. Some viewers may recognize these traits in a toxic friend. Some may recognize them in a relationship. Some may even recognize them in a family member, coworker, or authority figure. And for others, this video may finally explain why certain people always left them feeling emotionally exhausted without understanding why. The reality is that emotional harm does not always leave visible scars, but its effects can last for years. Many people lose confidence slowly because of manipulative personalities around them. Some stop trusting themselves. Some develop anxiety. Some begin apologizing constantly even when they did nothing wrong, and some become emotionally numb after spending too much time around people who quietly drain their energy and self-worth. The mind reacts strongly to emotional manipulation even when the victim cannot fully explain what is happening. That is why recognizing these traits early can protect your emotional health in ways most people never think about until it is too late. In this video, you will learn the 7 most common traits often connected to people with emotionally dark and harmful personalities. Some of these signs are obvious once explained, others are hidden so carefully that most people completely miss them. One of these traits is especially dangerous because society often praises it instead of questioning it. Many people mistake it for confidence, intelligence, or emotional strength when in reality it hides a complete lack of empathy underneath. By the end of this video, you will start noticing behavior patterns differently. You will understand why certain people leave others emotionally drained. You will understand how manipulators gain control without using force. You will understand why fake kindness can sometimes be more dangerous than open hatred. And most importantly, you will learn how repeated emotional behaviors reveal a person's true character far more honestly than appearances ever can. Some truths are uncomfortable, but ignoring them only makes dangerous people harder to recognize. The people who protect their peace best are usually the people who learned how to notice patterns early. They learned to trust actions over promises. They learned that emotional manipulation often hides behind charm. And they learned that not everybody deserves unlimited access to their trust, emotions, or loyalty. The 7 traits in this video may completely change the way you see certain people in your life. Some signs may feel disturbingly familiar. Some may explain past experiences that never made sense before. And some may help you avoid emotional damage in the future. Stay until the end because the final trait is one of the darkest and most psychologically damaging behaviors hidden inside toxic personalities, and most victims do not recognize it until serious emotional damage has already been done. If you enjoy deep psychology, human behavior, emotional intelligence, and powerful truths about the hidden side of people, then this channel is for you. Welcome to the Silent Empath, where we uncover the psychology behind human behavior, manipulation, emotional control, and the truths most people ignore. Subscribe now and join a community focused on awareness, clarity, emotional strength, and understanding the human mind on a deeper level. The first sign hides behind laughter more often than anger. Some of the coldest people do not attack openly in the beginning. Instead, they watch people suffer quietly and enjoy the emotional reaction that follows. There are individuals who feel strangely satisfied when someone feels embarrassed, insecure, rejected, or emotionally weak. Sometimes the reaction is small: a smile during another person's failure, a calm expression while someone cries, a sarcastic comment during a painful moment. Other times it becomes more obvious. Public humiliation disguised as humor, personal insults hidden inside jokes, cruel comments followed by "relax, I was kidding." And that sentence alone has protected countless toxic people from accountability. One of the most dangerous tricks emotionally cold people use is disguising cruelty as personality. They insult people and call it honesty. They humiliate people and call it humor. They disrespect boundaries and call it confidence. Slowly, people around them begin questioning whether they are too sensitive instead of recognizing the emotional damage happening in front of them. This is why emotionally harmful people often survive socially for years without being exposed. Their cruelty is subtle enough to avoid consequences but strong enough to hurt their target deeply. Many victims later realize the same pattern existed from the start. The person always seemed entertained by discomfort. They always pushed emotional pressure too far. They always seemed unusually calm during another person's pain. One disturbing psychological reality is that certain personalities feel emotionally powerful when others feel emotionally weak. Watching someone become insecure, embarrassed, confused, or emotionally dependent gives them a sense of control. It feeds their ego, it gives them emotional satisfaction, and this behavior can appear in friendships, relationships, workplaces, schools, and even families. Some people genuinely enjoy creating emotional discomfort because it makes them feel dominant. A healthy person usually feels concern when someone is hurt. An emotionally cold person often feels curiosity, amusement, or indifference instead. That emotional difference changes everything. You can learn a lot about a person by observing how they react to vulnerability. Pay attention when someone is embarrassed. Pay attention when someone fails publicly. Pay attention when someone is emotionally exposed. Good people usually become softer in those moments. Toxic people often become sharper. They become more sarcastic, more mocking, more dismissive, more entertained. And many times they do it with a smile that makes the cruelty harder to detect immediately. Some even turn another person's deepest insecurity into entertainment for the group. They notice what hurts people and use it strategically. Then, once the damage is done, they pretend the reaction is the real problem. They say things like, "You take everything personally," or "You're too emotional," after intentionally causing emotional pain. This creates a confusing cycle where the victim feels hurt but also feels guilty for reacting to the hurt. That confusion is exactly what manipulative personalities want, because confused people stop trusting their own emotions. There are people who study emotional reactions the same way others study information. They notice what makes people insecure. They notice fears, weaknesses, and emotional triggers. Then they use that knowledge later during arguments, jokes, or moments of tension. At first, it may seem small. A private insecurity mentioned casually in front of others, a painful memory turned into humor, a vulnerable confession used during conflict. But over time, patterns begin appearing. The person does not protect vulnerability, they weaponize it. And that reveals a serious lack of empathy underneath the surface. Real empathy creates emotional limits. It stops people from enjoying unnecessary pain. It creates guilt after causing harm. It creates discomfort after hurting someone emotionally. But emotionally cold individuals often lack those internal emotional boundaries. Some even feel emotionally energized by another person's discomfort. That is why certain people repeatedly cross lines without hesitation. They are not emotionally affected the same way healthy people are. One psychological study connected dark personality traits to reduced emotional concern for others during distress. In simple words, some people truly do not feel the same emotional reaction when they hurt someone. That does not mean they cannot understand emotions. Many manipulative individuals understand emotions extremely well. They simply use that understanding differently. Instead of protecting people emotionally, they use emotional knowledge to gain power. This becomes especially dangerous in close relationships because emotional trust gives manipulative people more information to use later. One of the clearest warning signs is repeated emotional humiliation disguised as entertainment. Some people constantly embarrass others publicly while pretending it is harmless fun. They target insecurities, appearance, intelligence, emotions, or mistakes. Then they laugh when the other person reacts emotionally. That reaction becomes part of the entertainment. The victim's discomfort becomes proof that the joke worked. Over time, this behavior slowly destroys confidence because the victim begins expecting humiliation regularly. They become anxious around the person, careful with words, careful with emotions, careful with vulnerability. And without realizing it, they begin shrinking emotionally around someone who enjoys controlling the emotional atmosphere. Another disturbing behavior is emotional testing. Some emotionally cold people intentionally hurt others just to observe the reaction. They push boundaries to see how much they can get away with. They say cruel things casually to measure tolerance levels. If the victim forgives quickly, the behavior escalates. This is why toxic personalities often become worse over time instead of better. Kindness without boundaries teaches manipulative people that emotional damage carries no real consequences. Some people mistake emotional cruelty for strength because the person appears fearless, blunt, or emotionally detached. But emotional coldness is not emotional maturity. A person who enjoys hurting vulnerable people is not powerful. They are emotionally disconnected. Truly strong people do not need to humiliate others to feel important. They do not need emotional dominance to feel secure. They do not feel satisfaction from another person's pain. Emotionally dangerous people often create environments where others feel nervous, insecure, or emotionally unsafe without fully understanding why. The tension becomes invisible but constant. People start monitoring their words carefully around them. They avoid vulnerability. They avoid emotional honesty. They fear becoming the next target of criticism, sarcasm, or humiliation. That emotional atmosphere alone reveals the presence of psychological toxicity. Healthy relationships create emotional safety. Toxic personalities create emotional tension. And many victims normalize this tension because it develops gradually over time. One dark reality about emotionally cold people is that they sometimes appear highly charismatic socially. They know how to entertain groups. They know how to appear funny and confident. But beneath that charm exists a pattern of emotional cruelty directed towards specific targets. This is why many victims struggle to explain their experiences. Outsiders only see the charming side. They do not see the manipulation hidden underneath private interactions. Some emotionally harmful people even enjoy maintaining two completely different images: publicly kind, privately cruel; publicly supportive, privately controlling; publicly funny, privately humiliating. That contrast creates even more confusion for victims because nobody else witnesses the darker behavior clearly enough to understand it. Over time, emotional coldness slowly evolves into something even more dangerous. A person who enjoys emotional discomfort eventually becomes comfortable, causing deeper emotional damage. Once empathy weakens enough, guilt weakens too. And when guilt disappears, harmful behavior becomes easier and easier to justify. That leads directly into the second trait. They never feel guilty. One of the most frightening things about emotionally dangerous people is how easily they move on after hurting someone. Healthy people usually replay painful moments in their minds. After causing emotional damage, they reflect, they feel discomfort. They think about the other person's emotions. Sometimes guilt stays with them for days or even years. But emotionally cold individuals often recover immediately after causing harm. They insult someone, manipulate someone, betray someone, or emotionally destroy someone, then continue their day normally. No reflection, no emotional weight, no real remorse. That emotional emptiness shocks many victims because they expect guilt to eventually change the person's behavior. But some people do not change because they simply do not care enough internally. Their emotional priority is protecting themselves, not protecting others. Apologies from these people often feel strange, empty, forced, rehearsed. The words may sound correct, but the emotional energy behind them feels missing. They apologize to end consequences, not because they truly regret the pain. Many toxic people become extremely skilled at fake accountability. They know what guilt is supposed to sound like, even if they do not genuinely feel it. They say, "I'm sorry you feel that way," instead of acknowledging actions directly. They blame stress, misunderstandings, childhood, pressure, or other people. They redirect focus away from their behavior constantly. Real accountability requires emotional honesty. Manipulative people usually avoid emotional honesty because honesty threatens control. Some apologies even become tools of manipulation themselves. They apologize dramatically to gain sympathy while continuing the same behavior repeatedly afterward. The pattern never changes because the apology was never connected to real remorse. It was connected to image management. This is why actions matter more than emotional speeches. A person who truly regrets hurting someone usually changes behavior over time. A manipulative person changes words temporarily while keeping the same harmful patterns alive underneath. One major warning sign is how quickly emotionally dangerous people justify harmful behavior. Instead of reflecting inwardly, they search for reasons why the victim deserved the treatment. They convince themselves the other person was too emotional, too difficult, too weak, too sensitive, too demanding, or too dramatic. This mental process protects their ego from guilt. If they blame the victim successfully, they never need to confront their own behavior honestly. Some people become experts at rewriting reality to protect themselves psychologically. Even after obvious emotional harm, they still position themselves as misunderstood or unfairly judged. Accountability feels threatening to them because accountability weakens emotional control. Another disturbing pattern is emotional detachment after causing serious damage. Some victims describe crying, begging for understanding, or expressing deep emotional pain while the other person remains unusually calm. That calmness can feel terrifying because it reveals emotional disconnection underneath the relationship. The victim expects empathy, concern, or sadness. Instead, they receive irritation, boredom, or emotional emptiness. In some cases, emotionally harmful people become annoyed by another person's pain because they see emotions as inconvenience rather than humanity. A dangerous person fears consequences more than hurting people. That sentence explains many toxic personalities perfectly. Their biggest concern is rarely the emotional damage itself. Their concern is exposure, embarrassment, losing control, losing reputation, or facing consequences. This is why some people only apologize after being caught publicly. Not privately, not internally. Public pressure forces accountability they would never choose willingly. And once consequences disappear, the harmful behavior quietly returns again. Many emotionally dangerous individuals see relationships through a selfish lens. They focus on what people provide rather than what people feel. Attention, loyalty, validation, emotional support, resources, status, control. Once someone stops providing emotional benefit, the manipulative person often becomes colder very quickly. This sudden emotional shift confuses victims deeply because the relationship once felt meaningful and emotionally close. But for emotionally empty individuals, attachment may be based more on usefulness than genuine emotional care. That realization becomes painful because it forces victims to question whether the connection was ever truly real. One psychological fact that many people overlook is that guilt acts like an internal emotional boundary. It prevents healthy people from crossing certain lines repeatedly. Without guilt, emotional cruelty becomes easier to repeat because there is no strong internal punishment stopping the behavior. That is why some people can lie constantly, betray repeatedly, manipulate endlessly, and still sleep peacefully at night. Their emotional system simply does not react strongly enough to create meaningful remorse. Some victims spend years waiting for emotional understanding that never arrives. They believe if they explain their pain clearly enough, eventually the other person will finally understand and change. But emotionally empty individuals often understand the pain already. They just prioritize themselves more than the pain they caused. That realization feels devastating because it destroys the belief that empathy alone can fix toxic people. Sometimes the issue is not misunderstanding. Sometimes the issue is lack of care. Another common pattern is selective morality. Emotionally dangerous people often expect kindness, loyalty, patience, and forgiveness from others while refusing to offer those same things consistently themselves. They create double standards where their own behavior always receives excuses, but everyone else's behavior receives harsh judgment. This imbalance creates emotional exhaustion for the people around them because the relationship slowly becomes emotionally one-sided. Victims constantly give understanding while receiving very little genuine understanding in return. Some manipulative personalities even become offended when others finally set boundaries. They react with anger, guilt trips, or victim behavior because boundaries reduce their emotional control. A healthy person may feel disappointed by boundaries, but they still respect them. Emotionally dangerous people often treat boundaries like personal attacks because limits threaten access and control. Over time, the absence of guilt creates another dangerous behavior: manipulation without remorse. Because they do not feel emotionally restricted by guilt, they become comfortable twisting reality itself to maintain power. And that is where the psychological damage often becomes much deeper. Manipulative people rarely control others through force in the beginning. They control through confusion. They twist conversations carefully. They change details. They deny obvious behavior. They create emotional doubt slowly. One conversation leaves you confused, another leaves you apologizing for things you did not even do. Eventually, you begin questioning your memory, your reactions, and your judgment. That is the true danger of manipulation. It attacks the mind quietly. One of the most common manipulation tactics is twisting words during emotional conversations. You express pain, and suddenly the focus shifts entirely onto your reaction instead of their behavior. You bring up disrespect, and suddenly you are accused of creating drama. You explain emotional hurt, and somehow you end up defending yourself instead. Manipulative people are extremely skilled at redirecting emotional responsibility away from themselves. They avoid direct accountability by changing the emotional direction of conversations constantly. This creates mental exhaustion because healthy communication becomes impossible. Every discussion turns into confusion, defense, or emotional chaos. Another major tactic is guilt manipulation. Emotionally dangerous people often use guilt to maintain emotional control over kind-hearted individuals. They make others feel selfish for having needs. They make others feel cruel for setting boundaries. They make others feel responsible for emotions they did not create. Over time, victims begin prioritizing the manipulator's emotional comfort above their own mental health. That imbalance slowly destroys emotional stability because the victim lives in constant fear of upsetting the manipulative person. Some manipulators become experts at acting innocent after causing emotional damage. They lie calmly, they deny obvious behavior confidently, they minimize harmful actions casually. This behavior becomes even more psychologically damaging because the victim begins feeling isolated inside their own reality. They know something painful happened, but the manipulator's confidence creates self-doubt. This is how gaslighting begins slowly. Not always through dramatic lies, sometimes through repeated denial, emotional invalidation, and subtle distortion of reality over time. Gaslighting becomes extremely dangerous because it weakens trust in personal perception itself. Victims stop trusting memories, they stop trusting emotions. They stop trusting instincts, and once that trust weakens enough, manipulation becomes much easier. A person who doubts themselves constantly becomes emotionally vulnerable to control. This is why many emotionally manipulative relationships leave people mentally exhausted. The brain stays trapped in constant emotional confusion. One day the manipulator acts loving, another day cold, one moment apologetic, another moment cruel. This inconsistency creates emotional instability that keeps victims emotionally attached while also emotionally distressed. The victim spends enormous energy trying to understand behavior that was never honest to begin with. Some manipulative personalities intentionally create emotional highs and lows because unpredictability strengthens emotional dependence. When kindness becomes inconsistent, people begin chasing emotional approval more intensely. This psychological pattern appears in many toxic relationships. Moments of affection temporarily erase moments of cruelty, creating confusion about the relationship overall. The victim remembers the good moments and hopes they represent the real person. Meanwhile, the harmful patterns continue underneath. One of the clearest signs of manipulation is leaving conversations feeling mentally drained and emotionally confused regularly. Healthy communication may involve disagreement, but it usually creates clarity eventually. Manipulative communication creates fog. You leave feeling guilty, anxious, uncertain, and emotionally unstable without fully understanding why. That emotional confusion is not accidental. For manipulative people, confusion creates advantage. Their goal is not truth. Their goal is control. Truth creates accountability. Control protects power. And because of that, manipulators often care more about winning emotionally than communicating honestly. Some people manipulate through fear. Others manipulate through guilt, pity, affection, silence, anger, or emotional withdrawal. The methods differ, but the goal stays similar. Emotional dominance. They want influence over thoughts, emotions, decisions, or behavior. And many victims do not recognize the manipulation immediately because it rarely starts aggressively. It starts subtly. Small lies, small guilt trips, small emotional distortions, but over time, those small behaviors grow into a powerful system of psychological control. Another painful reality is that manipulators often study the emotional needs of their targets carefully. They learn insecurities, fears, hopes, loneliness, and emotional weaknesses. Then they position themselves strategically inside those emotional gaps. They become supportive when support creates dependence. They become affectionate when affection creates attachment. They become understanding when understanding creates trust. But once emotional control strengthens, the manipulation becomes more visible gradually. Criticism increases. Confusion increases, emotional pressure increases, and by then the victim is already emotionally invested deeply. Some manipulative people even isolate others emotionally without obvious force. They slowly damage confidence, increase dependency, and create emotional distance between the victim and healthier influences. The victim becomes more emotionally trapped over time, while believing the manipulator understands them best. This psychological isolation becomes extremely dangerous because outside perspectives weaken. The manipulator's version of reality becomes dominant. One hidden sign of manipulation is emotional inconsistency designed to destabilize others psychologically. The manipulator changes moods suddenly, changes standards suddenly, changes expectations suddenly. The victim begins constantly adapting emotionally to avoid conflict or emotional punishment. This creates anxiety because emotional safety disappears. The victim never fully knows which version of the person they will face next. Over time, this emotional unpredictability damages mental peace deeply. Some victims later describe feeling emotionally exhausted every single day without understanding why until they finally escape the relationship dynamic entirely. Manipulative individuals also often test emotional loyalty repeatedly. They create situations where the victim must constantly prove care, patience, forgiveness, or loyalty while offering very little emotional stability themselves. The relationship becomes emotionally unequal. One person constantly gives emotional energy, the other constantly consumes it. And because manipulators fear losing control, they often react strongly when victims finally begin recognizing the unhealthy patterns. They may suddenly become extremely charming again, extremely apologetic, extremely emotional, extremely loving. But many times these changes are temporary attempts to regain emotional influence rather than genuine transformation. And to gain that control, they often hide behind charm. Charm becomes dangerous when it is used like a tool instead of a genuine human connection. Some of the most emotionally harmful people are not rude in the beginning. They are magnetic, warm, supportive, funny, attentive. They know exactly how to make people feel seen, valued, and emotionally safe at first. That is why so many people miss the warning signs early. They confuse attention with care. They confuse charm with kindness. They confuse emotional intensity with emotional honesty. But over time, a strange pattern begins to appear. The kindness only shows up when the person wants something. Their warmth becomes selective. Their personality changes depending on who benefits them most in that moment. Around powerful people, they become respectful and charming. Around vulnerable people, they become controlling. Around useful people, they become generous. Around people they no longer need, they become cold, dismissive, or emotionally absent. This constant personality shift reveals an uncomfortable truth. The kindness was never stable because it was never fully real. It was strategic. Some manipulative personalities study emotions the same way skilled salespeople study human behavior. They watch reactions carefully. They notice insecurities. They notice loneliness. They notice emotional needs. Then they shape their personality to match what the other person wants most. If someone needs validation, they become supportive. If someone needs protection, they become strong. If someone needs understanding, they become emotionally deep. In the beginning, this can feel almost perfect because the manipulator reflects back exactly what the other person emotionally craves. But eventually, cracks begin to appear. The effort fades, the warmth becomes inconsistent, the emotional support starts feeling transactional. And many victims later realize the person only acted caring while gaining emotional access, loyalty, attention, or control. One disturbing psychological fact is that manipulative people often mirror personalities intentionally. They adapt rapidly because adaptation gives them influence, They become whoever they need to become in order to gain trust faster. Healthy people usually remain emotionally consistent across different situations because their personality is genuine. Manipulative people often feel different depending on the environment because they are managing impressions constantly. Their behavior is shaped by advantage, not authenticity. This is why some people seem unbelievably kind at first, but later become emotionally exhausting. The mask requires energy to maintain, and eventually the real personality starts showing underneath. Another major sign is selective empathy. They care deeply when caring benefits them emotionally or socially, but the moment empathy becomes inconvenient, it disappears. They may comfort someone publicly while privately mocking that same person later. They may appear generous while secretly expecting loyalty, praise, or emotional debt in return. Their kindness often comes with hidden conditions. Real kindness does not constantly calculate emotional profit. Manipulative kindness does. Some emotionally dangerous people become extremely charming during moments where they fear losing influence. After conflict, boundaries, or emotional distance, they suddenly become affectionate again, attentive again, supportive again. This emotional switch confuses victims deeply because the kindness feels real in the moment, and sometimes parts of it may feel emotionally convincing even to the manipulator themselves. But the pattern repeats. Once emotional control returns, the warmth fades again. This cycle creates emotional addiction because the victim keeps chasing the caring version of the person they saw in the beginning. They believe that version is the real person hidden underneath stress or problems. But often the charming version was simply the version designed to gain access emotionally. One reason manipulative charm becomes so effective is because humans naturally trust people who make them feel emotionally important. Attention creates connection quickly. Compliments create attachment quickly. Emotional intensity creates trust quickly. Manipulators understand this. They know how to make people feel special in the beginning because emotional investment gives them future influence. Some even gather emotional information carefully during these early stages: fears, dreams, insecurities, past trauma, personal struggles. Then later, during moments of conflict or control, they use that same information strategically. What once felt like emotional intimacy slowly becomes emotional vulnerability in the wrong hands. Another disturbing pattern is how manipulative people often treat relationships like opportunities instead of emotional bonds. They evaluate usefulness constantly. Who can help them emotionally? Socially, financially, professionally, they maintain connections based on benefit more than genuine emotional care. This is why some people suddenly disappear once they stop gaining something valuable from the relationship. The emotional investment was connected to advantage, not loyalty. Victims often feel shocked by how quickly the warmth disappears because they believed the connection was authentic. But manipulative personalities can simulate emotional closeness without feeling deep emotional attachment the same way healthy people do. Their focus is often influence, validation, control, or access rather than genuine emotional connection. Some people do not connect emotionally. They connect strategically. That single truth explains countless toxic relationships. A healthy person builds relationships through honesty, trust, care, and emotional consistency. A manipulative person builds relationships through positioning. They position themselves close to people who offer value. They say the right things at the right time. They create emotional dependence slowly, and because they understand social behavior well, many manipulative personalities appear extremely socially intelligent. They know how to read rooms, they know how to appear trustworthy, they know how to create emotional chemistry quickly. But emotional chemistry alone does not equal emotional safety. Some of the most dangerous personalities are emotionally charming because charm lowers defenses. Another hidden sign is emotional inconsistency depending on status or usefulness. Watch how someone treats people who cannot benefit them. Watch how they treat service workers, emotionally vulnerable people, quiet individuals, or people beneath them socially. Manipulative personalities often reserve charm for people they want something from while showing coldness toward people they consider unimportant. This split reveals their true emotional structure underneath the performance. Genuine kindness usually stays relatively consistent regardless of status. Strategic kindness changes according to advantage. Some emotionally harmful individuals even create entire identities based on appearing helpful, wise, caring, or emotionally mature, while privately behaving in manipulative ways. Public image becomes extremely important because reputation protects access to future victims. This is why some toxic people appear deeply respected socially despite causing emotional damage privately. Their charm functions like armor. People struggle to believe victims because the manipulator appears too kind, too intelligent, too caring externally. That contrast creates enormous confusion and emotional isolation for those experiencing the darker side privately. Over time, however, the performance becomes harder to maintain completely. Small moments expose the truth: sudden coldness, cruel reactions, emotional selfishness, hidden arrogance, lack of empathy during difficult moments. Eventually, the mask starts slipping, and once it slips enough, another trait becomes impossible to ignore. They constantly play the victim. Nothing is ever their fault. Every story somehow places them as the misunderstood person, the betrayed person, the unfairly treated person, or the emotionally wounded person. Even after clearly hurting others, they redirect attention toward their own suffering instead. This behavior becomes emotionally exhausting because accountability never fully exists inside the relationship. Healthy people can admit mistakes, reflect honestly, and recognize the emotional impact of their behavior. Manipulative people often avoid accountability completely by transforming themselves into the victim during every conflict. One of the clearest signs is how every past relationship story sounds strangely similar. Every ex was toxic, every friend betrayed them, every coworker attacked them, every family member misunderstood them. Every conflict becomes evidence that the world treats them unfairly. At first, this may create sympathy. Many victims feel protective toward people who appear emotionally wounded constantly, but over time, patterns begin to appear. The person never reflects on their own role in repeated conflict. They never examine how their own behavior contributes to emotional chaos. The problem is always external. Someone else caused it. Someone else misunderstood them. Someone else forced them to react badly. This endless avoidance of responsibility reveals emotional immaturity at best and manipulation at worst. Some manipulative people use emotional pain strategically because sympathy creates influence. Tears can become tools. Sadness can become control. Vulnerability can become manipulation. That does not mean every emotional person is manipulative. Genuine pain exists. Genuine trauma exists. Genuine emotional struggle exists. But manipulative victim behavior follows specific patterns. The emotions appear strongest when accountability approaches. The suffering becomes most dramatic when boundaries appear. The sadness intensifies when control weakens. This emotional timing matters because it reveals intention underneath the behavior. One dangerous effect of victim manipulation is how it targets compassionate people specifically. Good-hearted individuals naturally want to help emotionally struggling people. They offer patience, understanding, forgiveness, second chances. Manipulators take advantage of this emotional instinct repeatedly. They create guilt whenever someone tries to hold them accountable. Suddenly, the victim feels cruel for expressing hurt. They feel selfish for setting boundaries. They feel responsible for the manipulator's emotional state. Slowly, the relationship shifts completely. One person becomes emotionally responsible for maintaining peace while the manipulator avoids responsibility entirely. Many victims later realize they spent years apologizing for reacting to behavior that should never have happened in the first place. Another major sign is emotional exaggeration after boundaries are introduced. Manipulative personalities often react dramatically when someone finally begins pulling away emotionally. They describe boundaries as abandonment. They describe accountability as attack. They describe emotional distance as cruelty. The goal is simple: make the other person feel guilty enough to return to the old dynamic. This creates confusion because healthy people genuinely do not want to hurt others unnecessarily. Manipulators exploit that empathy. They know compassionate people struggle with guilt, so they weaponize guilt constantly. Some people cry not because they are hurt, but because they lost control over you. That truth becomes painfully clear once patterns repeat enough times. The emotional reaction is not connected to empathy for the damage caused. It is connected to fear of losing influence. This is why manipulative individuals sometimes become incredibly emotional when victims finally detach. Suddenly they promise change. Suddenly they express deep love. Suddenly they appear emotionally devastated. But once control returns, the unhealthy behavior slowly returns too. The emotional crisis was connected to losing access, not genuine transformation. Another disturbing behavior is selective helplessness. Manipulative people often present themselves as emotionally incapable whenever accountability appears. They act confused, overwhelmed, misunderstood, or emotionally fragile to avoid responsibility. But outside those moments, they may function very strategically and confidently. This inconsistency reveals manipulation underneath the helplessness. The emotional weakness appears primarily when consequences approach. Victim playing also allows toxic people to recruit sympathy from outsiders. They tell selective versions of stories that protect their image while painting others negatively. This social manipulation creates even more emotional pressure on victims because now outsiders see them as cold, unreasonable, or unfair. The manipulator carefully controls perception to maintain emotional advantage. Some even provoke emotional reactions intentionally so they can later point to the victim's reaction as proof that they are the real problem. This tactic becomes deeply psychologically damaging because the victim feels trapped inside a distorted narrative constantly. Another hidden sign is how manipulative victims rarely change behavior long-term, despite endless emotional discussions. The stories change, the emotional speeches change, the tears change, but the harmful patterns remain strangely consistent underneath everything. Real accountability creates behavioral growth. Manipulative victimhood creates endless emotional cycles without meaningful change. Over time, good people begin losing themselves emotionally in these dynamics. They become exhausted from constantly proving they are not cruel. They over-explain themselves. They suppress their own needs. They avoid conflict to prevent emotional explosions. Their entire emotional world slowly begins revolving around managing another person's reactions. This emotional imbalance creates deep psychological stress because the relationship no longer feels equal or emotionally safe. And when sympathy stops working, control becomes more obvious. Emotionally dangerous people often reveal their deepest insecurity once emotional influence weakens. They need control over people. Control gives them emotional security. Without control, they feel unstable, threatened, rejected, or powerless. This is why boundaries trigger them so strongly. Boundaries reduce access. Independence reduces influence. Emotional freedom weakens manipulation. A healthy person may feel disappointed when others create distance, but they still respect personal autonomy. Controlling personalities often react with anger, guilt, pressure, monitoring, or emotional punishment instead. One of the clearest signs of control is discomfort with independence. Manipulative people often become irritated when others think for themselves, spend time away, develop confidence, or stop seeking constant approval. Emotional independence threatens the system of influence they worked hard to build. This is why toxic individuals sometimes subtly discourage growth, confidence, outside friendships, or personal freedom. A confident and emotionally independent person becomes harder to manipulate. Another hidden form of control is emotional monitoring. Some people constantly question where others are, who they talk to, what they think, why they acted differently, or why they need space. At first, this may appear like care or emotional investment, but over time the pattern becomes suffocating. Every decision requires emotional explanation. Every boundary creates tension. Every independent action becomes suspicious or emotionally punished. Slowly, freedom disappears inside the relationship without obvious force ever being used. Some controlling personalities use emotional withdrawal as punishment. If they do not get their way, they become cold, distant, silent, or emotionally unavailable. This creates anxiety because affection becomes connected to obedience. The victim learns subconsciously that emotional safety depends on keeping the controlling person satisfied. This conditioning becomes psychologically powerful over time because humans naturally seek emotional connection and stability. Another major sign is emotional domination during disagreements. Controlling individuals often interrupt, dismiss feelings, invalidate experiences, or escalate emotionally until the other person gives up entirely. The goal is not understanding. The goal is submission. They need emotional power during conflict because losing emotional control feels threatening internally. Some controlling people even disguise domination as protection or love. They say they are just worried while invading privacy constantly. They say they care too much while limiting freedom. They say they are protective while becoming emotionally possessive. This confusion makes controlling behavior harder to recognize because the language sounds emotionally caring on the surface. But real care respects autonomy. Control fears autonomy. One psychological reality about controlling personalities is that uncertainty makes them uncomfortable. They need reassurance through influence. They need emotional access. They need predictable power inside relationships. This is why emotionally independent people often threaten them deeply. Independence reduces emotional leverage. Boundaries reduce dominance. Self-respect weakens manipulation. Some toxic individuals become visibly angry when they realize someone no longer fears disappointing them. That emotional shift signals loss of control. And for manipulative personalities, loss of control feels deeply threatening. To an evil heart, your freedom feels like rebellion. That line explains why some people react aggressively when others finally choose peace, distance, or independence. The victim is no longer participating in the emotional system that once gave the manipulator power. This is why toxic people sometimes intensify manipulation once they feel someone slipping away emotionally. More guilt, more pressure, more emotional chaos, more promises, more intimidation. Anything to regain influence. Another hidden form of control is identity erosion. Some manipulative people slowly shape another person's personality over time through criticism, pressure, guilt, and emotional conditioning. The victim stops dressing the same way, stops speaking the same way, stops expressing opinions freely, stops pursuing goals confidently. Little by little, the controlling person reshapes the emotional world around them until the victim becomes smaller, quieter, and more dependent psychologically. This process often happens so gradually that victims barely notice it while living through it. Some controlling personalities also isolate people emotionally from healthier influences. They create tension around friends, family, hobbies, or independent activities. Sometimes this isolation happens openly. Other times it happens subtly through guilt, criticism, emotional pressure, or constant negativity. The goal is increased emotional dependency. Isolated people become easier to influence because alternative perspectives weaken over time. Another disturbing pattern is punishment after boundaries. Healthy people may feel disappointed by limits, but they eventually adjust respectfully. Controlling personalities often retaliate emotionally instead. Coldness, anger, mockery, guilt trips, emotional explosions, silent treatment. These reactions teach victims that self-protection carries emotional consequences. Over time, many people stop enforcing boundaries simply to avoid emotional punishment. This creates a deeply unhealthy dynamic where one person's comfort always matters more than the other person's peace. Control also explains why manipulative people struggle with rejection so intensely. Rejection threatens ego, influence, and emotional dominance simultaneously. Some react with rage, some react with victimhood, some react with obsession, others react with emotional destruction. And the darkest personalities respond by slowly destroying the confidence of the person pulling away. That leads into the final and most dangerous trait of all. They destroy people quietly. The most dangerous people rarely ruin lives overnight. They do it slowly, quietly, gradually. One comment at a time, one manipulation at a time, one emotional wound at a time. At first, the changes feel small. More anxiety, less confidence, more self-doubt, less emotional energy. The victim does not realize their identity is slowly being damaged because the destruction happens beneath the surface over long periods of time. One of the most frightening parts of emotional destruction is how invisible it looks from the outside. A person may still smile publicly while privately feeling emotionally exhausted every single day. They may still function normally while internally losing confidence, clarity, and peace. Manipulative people often weaken others psychologically so slowly that the victim adapts to the pain instead of recognizing it immediately. Small criticism becomes normal. Emotional invalidation becomes normal. Anxiety becomes normal. Confusion becomes normal. Over time, emotional suffering becomes part of daily life. Some emotionally dangerous people attack confidence directly, others destroy it indirectly through constant negativity, comparison, sarcasm, guilt, or emotional unpredictability. The result stays similar. The victim begins questioning their value constantly. They stop trusting their instincts. They stop feeling emotionally secure. One painful reality is that emotionally destructive people often target strengths first. Confidence becomes arrogance, boundaries become selfishness. Sensitivity becomes weakness. Passion becomes foolishness. Slowly, the victim begins shrinking emotionally to avoid criticism or conflict. Another hidden tactic is creating long-term self-doubt. Manipulators repeatedly challenge memories, emotions, decisions, and perceptions until the victim feels mentally unstable. Even after leaving the relationship, many victims continue second-guessing themselves for years because the psychological damage became internalized. The manipulator's voice remains inside their mind long after the relationship ends. Emotional isolation also becomes part of the destruction. Toxic people often separate victims emotionally from healthier relationships, support systems, and independent identity. The victim becomes more emotionally dependent while simultaneously feeling more emotionally empty. This contradiction creates deep psychological exhaustion. Another disturbing reality is that many victims do not fully recognize the damage until they finally experience emotional peace again later. Only then do they realize how anxious, drained, and emotionally controlled they had become. Some describe feeling like they lost themselves completely over time. Their personality changed, their confidence disappeared, their emotional energy collapsed. And it all happened slowly enough that they barely noticed while living through it. The most dangerous people don't destroy your life instantly. They destroy your mind slowly. That is what makes psychological manipulation so terrifying. Bruises heal visibly. Emotional erosion happens invisibly. Some victims spend years rebuilding self-worth after prolonged exposure to emotionally destructive personalities. The damage reaches identity itself, and by the time many people understand what happened, they are already carrying emotional wounds they cannot fully explain to others. Not everyone with an evil heart looks dangerous. Some look calm, some look intelligent, some look kind, and some even look deeply loving in the beginning. That is why so many people miss the signs for far too long. Evil does not always arrive with anger or violence. Sometimes it arrives with charm, attention, fake understanding, and carefully chosen words. Sometimes the people who damage your peace the most are the same people you trusted the deepest. But no matter how convincing someone appears on the surface, patterns always reveal character. Repeated manipulation reveals intention. Repeated disrespect reveals truth. Repeated emotional pain reveals who someone really is behind the mask they show the world. A person can pretend for days, months, even years, but eventually behavior exposes what words try to hide. That is why protecting your peace matters so much. Trust actions more than promises. Trust consistency more than charm, and never ignore red flags that appear again and again just because someone knows how to sound convincing afterward. Some people apologize beautifully and continue hurting others exactly the same way. Some people know how to look innocent while quietly destroying confidence, emotional stability, and self-worth behind closed doors. And many victims only understand the truth after the emotional damage becomes impossible to ignore anymore. If this video felt personal, you are probably not imagining things. Some lessons only come through painful experiences. Some people enter your life to teach you what manipulation looks like, what emotional control feels like, and what kind of energy should never be trusted again. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stop excusing behavior that continuously destroys their peace. Awareness changes everything. Once you recognize these patterns clearly, it becomes much harder for toxic people to control you emotionally again. If you want more deep videos about psychology, human behavior, manipulation, emotional intelligence, and the hidden truths behind toxic personalities, subscribe to The Silent Empath and become part of a community that sees beyond appearances. Like this video if it opened your eyes, and share it with someone who may need these signs before it is too late. Some warnings can protect years of someone's life, and sometimes one video is enough to make a person finally trust what they have been feeling all along.